Hello, everybody. Welcome to Cultivating Connections, the role of cultural brokers in promoting meaningful engagement with newcomer families. We are so excited to have you here with us today. This is going to be a really fun time. A couple of things to know before we get started is that firstly, this is a recorded session. So that, if you would like to participate in any way, we highly encourage that. We're really looking forward to just having discussions and reflections with you, but to let you know that this is recorded so that to just kind of let everybody know that, participation or discretion is definitely encouraged. But that secondly, because it is recorded, we will be able to share all of this information to you on YouTube. It's going to be accessible for folks if you like to share with anybody else that you think might have benefited from participating in the session. And everybody that is on the mailing list that has received emails from me regarding this seminar, regarding other seminars, will be receiving it in their inbox as well. So those are a couple of housekeeping items before we officially begin. But again, so happy to have you here with us today. I will be, as we're doing this presentation, doing as much as I can visual descriptors of each slide. So if you find that I am missing visual descriptions whenever we go from slide to slide, please feel free to let me know, whatever way you'd like to, and then I will adapt it accordingly. So thank you in advance for the accountability. I'm going to move on to the next slide over here. Before we begin, I'd love to just, invite everybody to share in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand. Firstly, your name and your title. Secondly, your school district, and also your position, where you're coming from, what your role is. And thirdly, your experience with newcomer families. A couple of examples of how you can share your experience with us regarding how you've been interacting with newcomer families is, firstly, how many newcomer families do you have in your district? Who have you been interacting with in the last 3 months that is related to newcomer family work? We'd love to hear from you. I see a couple of familiar names and faces. Welcome back again. So happy to have you here. But just to make sure that everybody is able to just get to know each other a little bit better, we welcome you to put down your introductions in the chat while we introduce ourselves. To begin us off, my name is Teng. I am a senior trainer and family engagement manager at the Federation for Children with Special Needs, also known as FCSN. FCSN is an umbrella organization that has historically worked with families with children with disabilities, but since the last around decade or so, we have expanded to reach more folks regarding family engagement with people such as our newcomer community, and that's really where my work is coming in and pertains to FCSN. We're so excited to be doing more work regarding newcomer families with everybody here today, and just to hear from you and your experiences, because your expertise is highly valued to all of us here. I have dark medium-ish black hair. I have bangs. I'm wearing glasses. I have a green turtleneck. My background is blurred, and I use she, they pronouns. And something that I always like to bring to this conversation while we're in this space together is to just, let people know that I myself am a Taiwanese immigrant. This is why this work is so important to me. I come to you with, you know, the willingness and the excitement of learning from you, as you have the expertise of being an educator, and also come to you with my own lived experience of immigration. From my experience of immigrating to this country and back and forth from my home country, Taiwan, being on 2 different types of visas, and all of the engagements that I've had, both as somebody that's gone through this process and also somebody that currently works in the sector. So that's a little bit on me. I'd love to pass the mic over to my lovely friend and co-presenter, Edith.
Thank you so much, Ann. I appreciate that. And I'm so excited to be here today. My name is Edith Bazile, and a little bit about me. I have worked in public education for 32 years, primarily Boston Public Schools. I started off as a speech pathologist. I was a special education teacher, lead teacher, and then became an administrator In my later years, I did a lot of professional development training. I worked at the Graduate School of UMass Boston, training teachers in special education specifically. My interest here is how do we really build the capacity of newcomer families to really navigate large districts or small districts so that their children get what they need. That's really important work as we know that the population of immigrant families is increasing and has increased. We have a lot of research that informs us of best practices. And I'm hoping that this collective conversation will really not only present some things that interest you, but you will also provide and share with each other what you know and what you're doing in your positions and at your schools and districts. So again, I'm really, really happy to be here and I look forward to this conversation. By the way, we do want this to be active engagement, and we are going to ask you to make comments in the chat. So I'm really looking forward to your input. So thank you so much.
Yes.
I want
Thank
to
you, Edith.
I want to start off with land acknowledgement. You know, we hear and experience land acknowledgement, and as we acknowledge standing on stolen land, I ask, how does this acknowledgement, how can it be used as a tool to reverse how Indigenous people have been invisibilized? And so we acknowledge that we are on stolen land wherever you may be, but how do we create equity, access, and opportunity for marginalized populations whose ancestors were massacred and their land stolen? My mother is Native American and my father is African American. And for enslaved Africans who were kidnapped and forced to build the economic foundation of this country, I also acknowledge that. And we need to pause and ask, how can land acknowledgement align with our equity goals? And in thinking of that, how do we create action? How does educational programming foster understanding of Indigenous peoples, both past and present? How do schools honor the descendants of oppressed and enslaved people? And finally, how are schools building capacity to accomplish and serve the needs of Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities to create a more just and inclusive world? So I just want to kind of create that umbrella around the principles of equity and inclusion as we talk about newcomers and immigrant families.
Yes. Thank you so much for that, Edith. I really appreciate it. And I also want to add on that, everybody that's here today, we really value the work that you're doing and we want to just take a moment to acknowledge and honor the effort and just like the time that you're taking out of your day to come here to this space together for us to have this conversation in the first place. And again, what Edith is saying about how we really want this to be like a collaborative space, um, and a space for community, and that we absolutely acknowledge that our states and our districts we have a lot of work to do on supporting all of the staff that is here with us today on making this happen. So thank you again for being here. We value your input. We value your presence. Please feel free to put at any point in the chat any sort of comments, any questions you want to make, and please feel free to utilize the Zoom functions to raise your hand if you'd like to say something or even just pitch in. We love to hear your voice. And before we begin further by talking a little bit more about the agenda, I just want to read out loud a couple of names of the districts that are here with us today, so we just all kind of know who is here and who we are. We see a lot of folks from Everett, Newburyport, Lowell, Andover, the Collaborative for Educational Services. Welcome. We see Lawrence, Brockton, Taunton. Let's see. Where else are we looking at? Ooh, a lot of folks from the Collaborative for Educational Services. We'll love to see you here. So exciting. Williamstown. And a lot of folks are liaisons. Brockton again. Everett, Cape Cod and the Islands. Everett. Wow, a lot of Everett. Hello and welcome. And also Bridgewater, Raynham. So excited to have you here. We've been seeing a lot of Everett in the last couple of webinars, so I'm so excited to just see you here again today. Oh, Cambridge. Hello, Cambridge. So, hello, and I'm excited to begin and speak to you further about the agenda for today that we have planned. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This, oh, you cannot see that. There we go. This slide is titled Agenda in colorful font. To the very top right, you will see a cropped out image of folks in a team holding hands and doing a cheer. You will also see on the bottom in the contents list a bunch of bullet points that I'm going to be going through with you. Edith is going to be starting us off with a couple of guiding principles to how we want to approach this work and how we want to introduce cultural brokering. After that, she's going to pass it back to me, and we'll be talking a little bit more about some statistics that we can share with folks, what it means to be living in our current reality, what that looks like in Massachusetts as a whole, before moving on to how we can relate all of this back to our work and family engagement, why it's important for us in our roles to know how family engagement pertains to our newcomer families, and we'll be doing a little bit more of some insight and analysis on a couple of voices and feedback that we've gotten from our community of practices monthly, especially in the March community of practice on parent voices and cultural gaps. We'll then be introducing cultural brokering as a concept before diving deeper into how that aligns with racial and cultural literacy. We're going to end off with another discussion on accessible language before breaking out into a deeper, more intimate conversational space on how we can utilize cultural brokering through different strategies and how that pertains to the family engagement frameworks in Massachusetts promoted by DESE. And then we'll end everything off with a nice and lovely community reflection. Again, we welcome all comments throughout any point in time. I'll be monitoring both the slides as well as the chats while we're both talking. If you see that I am not responding to a chat, please feel free to put it back in again, and I will do so. And we just want to make sure that this is both as accommodating, accessible, and also as welcoming of a group as we can possibly make it. So without further ado, let's move on to our guiding principles. Edith, I'm going to pass the mic over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So community agreements, sometimes we call them norms, but that's not really an inclusive term. So I'm going to call it community agreement. And so why am I starting off with accountable space? I know you've heard safe spaces. And so safe spaces to me, and I just want to talk about the first one because I think it really relates to the conversation that we're having. A safe space is a sort of an artificial concept because there is no formula or guarantee that spells out how you can provide a space that protects people from microaggressions or discrimination or even biases. But still, we intend to create safe spaces. It's a lofty intention when discussing topics that challenges systems that uphold privilege and status quo within organizations. Calling spaces safe spaces and asking people to step outside of their comfort zone, I believe, has not really worked for communities that have been disenfranchised in school structures. So I want you to kind of think about that safe space narrative. So then we often hear brave spaces. Well, brave spaces have a problem because often it's those same communities that are oppressed that are expected to have the courage to speak their authentic truth and share their experiences with the expectations that others will listen and learn. Brave spaces are often personally draining and exhausting because groups that face discrimination and oppression must be brave all the time and everywhere. So how do we move beyond expecting individuals who are trying to change how institutions respond and by educating them and sharing their experiences away from brave spaces where we're doing all the work? I like the term accountable spaces. So what is an accountable space? Accountability means you're taking personal responsibility for your intentions and your impact. It means embracing good intentions, but also committing to action. And that action may look like allyship for communities seeking racial equity and social justice. And placing the burden on those communities to be brave is something that we want to avoid. Does that make sense? Thumbs up if that makes sense. It means really engaging in meaningful discourse and making actionable strides towards equity and inclusion. So that's the meaning, and I know that took a few minutes, of accountable spaces. We often hear for the next one, lean into difficulty. Well, what does that mean for me if a conversation about equity is difficult? I say lean into positivity because that's where you grow, you learn, you develop. And these are positive elements that we want to experience as an outcome of our collective work. Using I statements means just not sharing others' lived experience, really talking about what matters in your experience and being mindful of the impact of what you say and not just your intent. This is everyone's discussion, so we are going to ask you to be engaged in the chat and also respecting everyone's humanity. That means the whole person and all of our multiple identities and intersectionality. If that works for you, if you could just give me a thumbs up, or if there's something that I missed that you think should be part of the community agreement, let's discuss that as well. But if you want to do thumbs up or hand raise or unmute yourself and think about it, that's fine. But I just want to make sure that we're in agreement with the community agreements. Is that a yes? Okay. No discussion? Awesome.
Okay. Shall I move on to the next slide, Edith?
Yes, please. So I think I want to lay out a scenario for you, if I may, because I think as we do this work, we want to kind of think about how it impacts us individually. So let's do a little exercise. I want you to think back to when you were 5 or 10 or 15 years old, and you're living somewhere, and all of a sudden your family moves to another country. You're moving someplace where you know no one, and you're restarting your family is restarting your life. So just thinking of who you were at age 5, at age 10, or at age 15. And all of a sudden you're uprooted. You leave your country of origin and you are in a new space. I want you to bring with you the thoughts of what were your goals? What were your dreams? What were your aspirations? What experiences did you have as you go into this new territory, as your family restarts their life? And so maybe someone could put in the chat, which country are you going to? Just name a country, any country. And then, Ian, if you could help me with the chat conversation. And so I want you to think of what does that look like for you as a 5, a 10, or a 15-year-old? What do you worry about? What do you dream about? How are you hoping others will receive you? Maybe you're with your parents, maybe you're with a cousin, or maybe you're with some other relative, and you're in a new home, and now you have to enter school. How do you hope that school will receive you? What are the kinds of barriers that you think you'll experience? Now I'm going to throw in another piece. So someone said France. And so what do you have to get used to? What adjustments would you have to make as that 5, 10, or 15-year-old? Now I want you to throw in another scenario. You are Black or brown. I want to throw another scenario in. You have a disability. So how do you navigate this new life that you're in? You are not on a military base because obviously you're going to be supported. You are just restarting your life. And so I think if we think about it in that way, what are your primary needs as a child? and as a family. And so as you think about that, I know that there's great work being done in a lot of districts. And I always like to start with the positives. And thinking of that scenario, connected to one positive thing that school, your district is currently doing to build connections and embrace the growing population of newcomers, whatever that might be. And this is the time where I want you to put it in the chat, like, but sharing is caring in our professional world. And it's really important to share best practices, and best practices exist. Oftentimes we talk about what needs to be done, but we don't give acknowledgement to districts and schools that are already doing a great job, that have best practices that need to be scaled and can be shared with other learning communities so they adopt it. So what kinds of things would you say are being provided in your school or your district that you know is a best practice that is currently being used? I like to begin with the positive in mind. So this is where we lean into positivity. And so Ian is going to share some of the comments that come out of that. And I think that's going to be a backdrop to kind of think about and look at how we can add to that list of positive connections, embracing the population of newcomers. And I see some really good comments in here.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
They're really
And
awesome.
do you want to share some of them?
Yeah, sure. Danielle is saying that they provide general information in their own language, which is awesome. Monica shares orientation day for the first day of students. Joelle says that they're working really hard to make sure that all communications from the school are available in families' languages. Kathleen is sharing that, connecting generally with my fellow students, developing a relationship with my teacher, learning a new language. Melissa says having a liaison available. Lisa Marie says, we welcomed 30 newcomers by providing their families communication and wraparound services during their registration process, then provided each student a backpack filled with school supplies. That was just the beginning.
Awesome. And please keep those good things generating, because that's what gives us hopes as schools and districts, as a collective community, to share our best practices. So a district or school that may be struggling, like, how do I advance this work, gets it from colleagues, because we are a community of practice. We are a professional learning community. That's awesome. Thank you for all of your comments and your feedback. Next slide. And so we know that there are persistent gaps in specific populations. And I love this quote from Martin Luther King, and I would love at this time for someone to unmute and just read it. Because we are, we all learn together. And so your voices, eager to hear your voices and to get your input. So if someone could just unmute and read this quote, that would be awesome.
Says, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angela. I appreciate that. And so we're all interconnected. We're all interrelated. What happens to one impacts the entire community. We all know that as educators, that if we have one student that is struggling, then that whole class dynamic is going to be off a bit. And so how do we ensure that all learners are engaged? Well, this is deep work. I want to just say that, yes, we have persistent disparities that exist among our students and enrollment patterns that require our serious examination. We often hear opportunity gaps or achievement gaps. I want to bring in something that Gloria Lanson Billings says. She calls it an education debt. That when you walk into a school, what can that school provide to close these gaps? And how can barriers be removed so that the learner is someone who is honored, welcome, and feels that the learning environment is aspirational for them? If we see persisting gaps, is that because the population of students are not able to learn? I don't think anyone agrees with that. I think it calls for action by schools in terms of what can we do better? How can we reach those learners who seem to be persistently left out? Because that's where the work is done. So when we look at this scenario, we know that it's important to think about cultural and racial literacy. Well, what does that actually mean? Racial literacy is the key to understanding how systemic cultures, systemic structures of inequity are built in institutions. You know, we yearn for the day that we wake up and race or racism just doesn't exist. Well, that's not the reality. We know that when public education was founded in 1635 in Boston, Massachusetts, certain individuals were not allowed to walk into these buildings because they were Black, because of their immigrant status, because they were female. And so what are the remnants of this colonialism that still exists that create barriers? It really is about thinking about how do we reimagine school structures so that they are welcoming and so students don't have to adapt to a system that wasn't originally designed for them. And so when we talk about racial literacy, it really means arming ourselves with knowledge, with strategies, and with the emotional intelligence to resolve conflicts within organizations that lead to patterns of underachievement in some groups, and also ensuring that we have a lens that is asset building and we have a set of educational practices that empowers all students. And in this case, we're talking about immigrant population, newcomers. Racial literacy is a commitment to action to embrace the full humanity of all students, and it's a commitment to become anti-racist. And so the first step towards racial justice and healing is having racial literacy and having the knowledge of systems and how they work. So you can recognize barriers, which we are going to talk about as we advance this conversation. It's not whether or not you like certain individuals. That's not what it's about. It's not a personal thing. It is about understanding systems and practices that are in place that lead to implicit bias and analyzing and transforming those systems to be anti-racist. It's about embracing the full humanity of people who don't look like you. So we work towards creating schools that are truly inclusive. So cultural literacy, what is cultural literacy? Well, to be culturally literate in an interconnected, diverse society means that you have knowledge about more than a people's art or dress or food and festivals. You're moving beyond heroes and holidays, and you're really developing a deeper knowledge about values, customs, traditions, beliefs, perceptions, rules, status, roles, and thought patterns. It's really looking at the worldview of a specific culture, and it's important to acknowledge the myths that we hold about other cultures that are hard to die. It's hard to eradicate. And one of the biggest myths to me, which I want to put out there, is that one can be culturally competent. How can you be culturally competent in a culture that you did not grow up in? And as we talk about that, you'll see that, yes, you can become culturally responsive and really understand how to remove barriers and be more inclusive. But cultural competence, in my eyes, is not something that someone can achieve. You don't truly know a culture that is not a culture that you grew up in, because there's so much there. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's move on to the next slide. And so a little bit of talk about isms and schisms. This is a big piece right here. And I'm gonna step out and just talk about a schism. In 1870 and 1872, the AMA refused to seat 3 African-American delegates who were Black doctors. And so Black doctors founded their own organization called the National Medical Association. They were banned to wards that were charity wards, that were what they call colored wards, or they were banned from hospitals altogether. So what did they do? They built their own medical schools and hospitals, and there were 7 by 1909. Recently, the AMA apologized because at the time that these hospitals were built, the head of the AMA commissioned a doctor to visit and evaluate those hospitals and recommended that all but 2 close. And because they couldn't get any funding, they ended up closing. So in 1963, Dr. Cobb became president of the NMA, the National Medical Association. And at that time, he talked about how they were continuing gatekeeping strategies to keep Black doctors out of the AMA by way of not giving them specialty credentials and just this barriers that existed. So the AMA apologized for this, and that's a schism. So when we look at the cultural iceberg, yes, there are things that, and I'm kind of looking at this cultural iceberg in 2 ways, because there is something called cultural racism. And that example that I gave is very overt. Do we see that happening? No. Are people not getting in the door? Well, sometimes. This iceberg represents cultural racism. And cultural racism has been described as overt acts of discrimination, which is the tip of the iceberg. Some of it includes when we see migrant families locked in cages and children separated from their families. That's very overt, right? We see Black boys overrepresented in substantially separate special education classrooms and in detention facilities. That's pretty overt. This is why we say that the iceberg, the parts that we see, are not enough. It's what happens underneath, where systems perpetuate this in their structures and within their institutions. So in thinking about this iceberg and what's underneath it, often it's hidden. We see the results of the practices. And so when we think about migrant families, we say in most districts, we know that there is either underrepresentation or overrepresentation in special ed. Oftentimes they are labeled with a communication impairment. We have to look at how often are migrant families prepared to take AP courses, migrant students prepared to take AP courses or to get into exam schools. We have to look at graduation rates and all of that. But we also have to look at the murky waters surrounding the iceberg and what upholds practices that denies opportunity to students. What are the myths and stereotypes that we need to address and get rid of? And what obscures at the same time what is happening and protects these practices that are not helpful. So under enrollment of Black and Latino students in AP courses and exam schools, we're often blind to the structures, just like a fish cannot perceive the water that it swims in. So it's important for us to really think about all of those elements in terms of understanding what barriers exist and how we can address those barriers. Now, many of you may have heard of Carol Dweck's fixed in mindset, and this really speaks to understanding how students are perceived. Some students who are new to this country, just like you, that 5, 10, or 15-year-old, you may have a great wealth of innate talent, abilities, skills, knowledge, and also goals. But all of a sudden, when you're uprooted and you are in a new environment, how does that new school elicit from you your best ability? And in thinking about that, how do we fit in this continuum of a growth or a fixed mindset. A growth mindset says that intelligence can be improved, or intelligence can be nurtured, and students have the capacity to do things beyond where they currently are. A fixed mindset says, well, it is what it is. These students are just not learning at an accelerated rate. And so really thinking about how do we address and debunk the whole myth of the fixed and the growth mindset, which is really critical to how we look at students who are new to this country. Going back to your 5, 10, or 15-year-old, maybe you were an accelerated learner. Maybe you were good at math, at sciences. But then when you go to your new country, and some people put in France or Italy or other places, how is that acknowledged? What do we need to do to really tap into those skills and those gifts and talents that you possess? The language is a barrier, but yes, institutions become barriers if there are not ways for us to access your skills, talents, and gifts. And so in thinking about that, we have many migrant students, newcomers, who may be gifted underachievers. And, even when we think about the language that we use, for example, we went from English language learners to English learners, but they're not English learners because they already have a whole language system, right? They are multicultural learners. They are multilingual learners, multilingual learners, because they already have a whole language. And so if we say you're an English learner, that means English is the only important thing that we have. But how do we take what you know in the ways that you know it, the bodies of information, the funds of knowledge that you possess, and because you can't speak the language, how do we extract from you that knowledge to accelerate your learning? And so I'm going to keep going back to that 5, 10, or 15-year-old, that you don't change because you go to another country. There are barriers that exist that have to be overcome in order for you to express your gifts, talents, and innate abilities. Does that make sense? Thumbs up if you agree. Awesome. Let's move on. And so it is important for us to understand all of the elements of what we're talking about. But this saying here, if somebody could just read that quote out aloud, that would be great. I'd love to hear your voices, if that's okay. Any volunteer?
It is not who you, sorry, it is not who you attend school with, it is who controls the school you attend.
And so, thank you, Kathleen. This really speaks, this is Nikki Giovanni. This really speaks to how do we build a collaborative table sharing partnership with parents and families so there is power sharing and idea building. And some of you are already doing this work. In order to do that, we have to be humble and learn what we as educators don't know. So how do you learn what you need to know, but you don't know? It is asking, who's doing the learning? As we address the needs of newcomers, we have to really learn how to reframe our thinking about ensuring that we're creating aspirational learning environments for students. And that takes a lot of work. And as we begin to talk about cultural brokering, that is a critical piece of it. And just steering away from viewing newcomer families as a monolith, because not only are newcomer families individuals, we need to know everything about the intersectionalities of newcomers. We need to understand their racial identity, their gender, their nationality, disability, their gender identification. And a lot of times we ignore certain pieces and only focus on one. It's important for us to focus on all of them. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Anne at this point.
Yes, thank you, Edith. So after Edith has done an amazing job of, just kind of routing our conversation to what types of principles and what type of tone we want to approach this kind of work with, I'd like to redirect everybody back to a statistic that you'll see on the screen. To the left, you will see a pie chart. To the right is a written out statement of the statistic that it's portraying. The topic of the slide is our current reality. To the right of that, you'll see a picture of a woman thinking, and below that, on the very, very bottom, is a question that we're going to consider later as a reflection. But let's start off with acknowledging this fact that we see in front of us. About 1 in every 6 Massachusetts residents is foreign born. That is around 17.6% of our population. This may be a statistic that some folks have already seen, especially if you've been in our prior webinars regarding newcomer families before. But for a lot of us, this may be a new statistic. This may be a new idea and new insight that we didn't know about. And this was certainly surprising to me when I first saw the statistic. And I just like to take a couple of seconds here to just kind of let this sink in. So just let everybody take a look visually at this chart in front of you and to think really, really deeply about what the implications of this statistic means for our work in our districts and especially pertaining to newcomer families. Give it a couple of seconds. And while we are thinking about this statistic, I'd like to pose a couple of questions that I would actually love if people could, respond in the chat if possible, as we're just kind of thinking more, ruminating about this implication. For instance, what is the number of languages that are being spoken in your district? How many languages, at least how many languages, does your district accommodate? What does that look like for you? I'm going to give it a couple of seconds for people to also just jump in the chat and let me know the numbers. So while folks are doing this and thinking about the number of languages that are actively being spoken in your district, or at least as much as, what we know so far about our districts, because there's always more to learn. Oh, I see 4 from Melissa. Thank you. 4 is a lot already. While folks are continuously dropping this in the chat, I'd also like to just add on that alongside this statistic, there is a lot of public records through the Department of Homeland Security, through the Department of State, the Department of Education that I'd like to share with everybody here today. And before I do so, I would like to just take some time also to define what newcomer families really means. So a definition that we like to use is that newcomer families is an umbrella term that refers to any foreign-born students and their families who have recently arrived in the United States. And this definition is from the Department of Education. The term newcomer family therefore encompasses a lot of the population of this 17.6%. It encompasses a lot of families from students that have been here for generations. So this kind of work that we're doing here on figuring out what is accessible to people, what kinds of cultural brokering, what kinds of engagement do we want families to know that we're doing, it's critical not only for just our newcomer population, but for everyone. It is critical work for everybody that, is facing this sort of statistic. It's critical for family engagement in general. And it's also critical for understanding the system and the reality that we live in. Before I continue on, I'm just going to read out a couple of numbers that I see on the screen. About 60 spoken languages from Aaron and 6 to 7 regularly accommodated. That is a huge and amazing statistic to pull out. Monica says 5. Sarah also says at least 5. Kathleen says 10. A lot of 4s. One that says more than 15. Wow, this is a lot. Thank you all for sharing. We also have 20, but then there are 4 top languages: Portuguese, Indian languages collectively, Spanish, Arabic. That's amazing to see. Thank you all for sharing again. I'd like to bring us back to a couple of statistics that I'd like to share. So we know, especially from this statistic, that the number of foreign-born Massachusetts residents has increased very much significantly in the last few decades. And since 1990, this number has doubled steadily. It hasn't just been going up, it has shot up. In the last 10 years, starting from 2014, the number of Haitian newcomer arrivals that were met at US borders has risen to 80K, with the increase spiking in the last 4 years. And all of this data, I mentioned this before, just going to say it again in case anybody wants to check this out later by themselves, is gathered from the Immigrant Enforcement and Legal Processes monthly tables from the Department of Homeland Security. So all this data is almost always monthly updated. And from what we're seeing, this is an issue, this is a challenge that we're facing that is not going to go away. We will always have newcomer families. We will always be wanting to adapt the system and the way that we exist in as much as we can for our newcomer families. And this is going to be impacting family engagement for as long as the system exists. So while these newcomer waves that we are experiencing do come and go, the number of newcomer folks in this area and also just generally in the states at large is changing constantly. And more importantly, may not always be the demographics that we hear about in our circles or just generally in the media. So some discussions recently, as of now, has been most widely on the wave of Haitian newcomer families, but I also just generally like to bring some additional statistics to the table here, so that we can focus on and highlight also some other folks that have been arriving in Massachusetts. So in January of 2024, the beginning of this year alone, there has been 2,073 newcomers from Burma, 4,626 newcomers from Afghanistan, 5,837 newcomers from Syria, and the highest being 7,408 newcomers from the Democratic Republic of Congo. These numbers are gathered by the Refugee Processing Center's Refugee Admissions Report, and this highlights refugee arrivals by state and also by nationality. I know that was a lot to read out. If you have any questions or if you would like for me to repeat any of these numbers, I am more than happy to do so, and just please drop it in the chat. But I do want to just emphasize that all of this information is to say that newcomer families come from many, many different places and have many different experiences, both in their immigration process, but also in how they resettle in the States. The only thing that is the same for all of our newcomer families that are going through this refugee process is the way that they are very much rigorously screened by government agencies such as USCIS before they are allowed to set foot in our local communities. Most of, if not all of our newcomer families do not know where they're going to be ending up. They don't know what state they're going to be in. They don't know what community they're going to be in before they are there themselves. So thus, the ways that we welcome newcomer families cannot be the same. We can share as many strategies as we can to think about this work, to really, encompass all that we know about family engagement, to personalize it to the best that we can for our districts. But because we know now of the rising increase in these numbers, because we know that about 1 in every 6 Massachusetts residents is foreign born, we know that the way that we approach this work is going to be very much intentional. It's going to really encompass all of the strategies that we're using right now, all the ones that all of you excellent, amazing educators are, creating, what we're all trying to do together, but to really adapt it, make it proactive in the long term, and make sure that this is something that is going to be strengthened so that in the future, when we keep on embracing our newcomer families, when we keep on embracing immigrant families in general to our table, we know that there is already something in place for folks so that we don't have to always keep making new things, keep creating new strategies, but to really normalize and standardize this process of, hey, we are welcoming families. This is the reality. Let's think about it and sit with it. And where do we go from there? Edith, would you like to add anything on?
Yeah, I just want to say that what Anne is really illustrating for me is how newcomers are often often experience isolation and stress and feeling lost and overwhelmed and powerless as they try to navigate not only this new environment that they have, but also our school systems and accessing services. So this can be compounded by newcomers when they have children with special needs, for example, if they have children with disabilities, or if they are accelerated learners, or if they have medical needs as well. So it really is, how do we use a village approach to address the needs of newcomers and really restructure our approaches in a proactive way, because we know that there will be a continual acceleration of linguistically and culturally diverse population of students in all districts. That's just a reality. And when it comes to bilingual staff, we know that there's not enough that speak the language, but also share the culture. So that's another area as we begin to talk about cultural brokering that can be used as a social justice practice, and that is research and evidence-based that helps parents navigate educational systems. And there's an increasing need. This is not new work. This is work that has been codified in the research and has been occurring for decades. And there is there's increasing need for it. So I just want to amplify that in terms of making this a process that is seamless for parents and building parents' capacity to be self-advocates as well. Also, parent-to-parent advocacy is important in this regard.
That's very well said. We'll be discussing statistics like this and strategies to kind of think about how we can really organize our work in our next upcoming webinar as well on April 17th, called Unlocking the School System. So I also encourage folks, if you haven't already, to register for that one in case you'd like to learn more about these statistics and what that means for all of us. So
And I think it's important to talk about why, because what we know from the research is that strong parental involvement in their students' educational journeys enhances the appropriate educational services, and it also improves the long-term success of children in school. So really addressing the needs of families and welcoming families and making them feel that they have a voice in this process and they can be part of the decision-making is the challenge of all school districts.
Thank you, Edith. I'll move on to the next slide. And this one is a definition of family engagement from the U.S. Department of Education, also cited by the Department of Health and Human Services. You'll see two descriptive images to the right of the screen. The first one is questioned, what is family engagement in colorful fonts? And the second one on the very bottom is a three-way Venn diagram of family engagement. And as Edith has described before, family engagement, as we all know and have known for a very long time, is a highly researched, a highly researched idea and concept. And I just like to very quickly define it for everybody so that we are all on the same page about what it is and how we can view this work together. So if I could also just take the time to invite somebody to read the definition on the screen, that would be absolutely lovely. I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds and see if I have any takers.
I'll do it again. Family engagement refers to the systematic inclusion of families in activities and programs that promote children's development, learning, and wellness, including the planning, development, and evaluation of such activities, programs, and systems.
Thank you, Kathleen. I appreciate you very, very much. Thank you for being here. But thank you for reading this, Kathleen. What we really want to emphasize is to think about what this definition entails and to, when we're thinking about this definition, just also think of terms or terms that already exist in it that you really value or really immediately jumps to mind for you when we think about family engagement. And I would love to invite people while I'm, going over the next couple of slides to also just continuously post into the chat what words jump out at you from this definition. For instance, mine is evaluation, really collecting data, understanding the context of where families are coming from, who our educators are, and what kinds of systems we have in place in order to demonstrate and design family engagement in a way that is personal, that is intentional. So evaluation is the word that I would pick from this definition. And I would like to invite people to just also either say it out loud or put in the chat any other, words in here or terms that you find is meaningful to you and the work that you are doing. But to go back again to the right side of the screen of that three-way Venn diagram image, it's also just generally important. Folks will find this familiar if you've been to our 10-hour PD series, that getting to know families is a critical part of family engagement. It's a little bit of what we just did when we were talking about the 17.6% statistic on who our families are and the basic context behind who we are trying to reach. Going in a counterclockwise fashion below that, we have meaningfully involving families, and Edith is going to be speaking a lot more to that later as well as lastly, building positive relationships. So how do we foster meaningful connections with folks in a way that involves people's backgrounds, that involves people's cultures, in a way that brings in their languages, brings in their experiences, in a way that, really promotes a mutual learning path for all of us? And what does that look like in a system designed not necessarily, as Edith has mentioned, for our families? I'm going to move on over.
And I just want to add one more thing to that before we go on, because it's the systemic inclusion. I want to acknowledge that there are islands of excellence that exist in this work. And one of the challenges is, how do we scale that across schools? Or how do we use those practices? How do we replicate those practices when someone leaves? We always hear, oh my God, she's a great teacher, great school leader. The superintendent has this vision. But then often when these people leave our schools, the work leaves with them. And it's because systems and structures are hard to change. I think one of the things that is happening, this term inclusion, there's no one that disagrees with inclusion, but it really is, what does that mean? What is the vision? How is it research and evidence-based? And how is it going to foster the type of outcomes that we want? Because we know that when we talk about inclusion for students with disabilities, oftentimes, sadly, it's dumping students into the classroom without the prerequisite supports and strategies, interventions that they need, or the additional staff that is needed in order to do that work. And so with that systematic inclusion, there has to be specialization. So I question, how is professional development provided? But not just professional development, job embedded coaching, mentoring for teachers, the resources that are necessary, the technology. So how are those supports aligned with the outcomes that we want? And programming evaluation is really important and should be data driven. But if the program is not the right program, then, how do we ensure that there is alignment with the need out there and the types of programming and instructional practice that schools are engaged in? Sometimes we continue to do the same thing and don't get advanced results. So this is a time for shifting. I know during the pandemic, we talked about reimagining education. Well, we need to reimagine these systems and structures that we've created for our migrant families and for our newcomers so that we can get better results. And so I think that this is a really important slide. And with most districts, it's the biggest challenge. Family engagement, we don't want families to just be engaged. We want to use the power of families. We often say that we are empowering families. Families have power. They already have the power. And how do we leverage that so that they are partners and they have parity with us around saying what is needed for their children? Because no one can better serve you without your input, because you know what your needs are, you know what the needs of your families, what your family is, and your journey to this place. So it's really having that conversation, but that action-oriented, meaningful, involved family partnership. And I'd love to hear from anyone else if you want to add to this, because Ann and I do love the engagement. And so if someone wants to add to that or say, yes, we're doing, this in our district, please feel free to use the hand raise feature or unmute yourself, because we do want to hear from you.
We've had a couple of folks say a couple of terms that they really, resonated with in the slides as well. Wayne says development, Kathleen says inclusion and activities, Valeria says inclusion, Monica says support and inclusion. I think something that's really awesome is that we really all identify with the idea of being inclusive in our work. So thank you all for sharing, and we welcome more as well. And thank you, Edith, for your insight. I shall move on over to the next slide. This slide is a little bit on family engagement research. We've mentioned before that family engagement is heavily researched. It's an idea, as we all know, that has been around for a little bit of time, and it really encompasses a lot of the issues that we aim to solve. So I'd like to just kind of go over that a little bit, and before I do so, give a brief image description of what the slide is. On the very top, you will see the topic family engagement research with a little colorful swooshy font that says conclude, very swooshy. Underneath that, you'll see an orange block that says regardless of family income or background, children with involved parents are more likely to, and then is below that a bullet list of different actions that happens when we really engage with families in more family engagements. To read out a little bit of them first, I'd like to just mention that we know from the research that children with involved parents are more likely to attend school regularly, to have better social skills, to earn higher grades and test scores, to pass their classes, and also to graduate and attend post-secondary education and careers. And all of that is incredibly important, especially when we're thinking about newcomer families, because it therefore completely changes the trajectory of a family and a student's lives, especially when they are going through a resettlement process. So how do we make sure that family engagement is a concept that newcomer families can see themselves aligning with while they are struggling with getting basic needs, while they are struggling to get acclimated to the language and culture here, while they are struggling to, figure out things for themselves regarding their background that is so different for every newcomer family that is coming here, while also navigating, potentially resettling in a different area of maybe the state, maybe out of the state, finding their community, getting used to different concepts, figuring out transit for not only themselves but also their kiddos, as well as job security and home security. So this is a lot of energy and a lot of effort, and we definitely recognize that for both ends. But this is the reality of our situation, in which if we do not find ways to engage our families with all of these topics and have folks be on the same page about this process, there is a lot that will be missing from the table, especially when we are encouraging folks to bring, their strengths over to our schools as well. And because research in the field of family engagement has shown that when families are involved, children achieve more, there is more student success. I also want to just also really quickly point out, changing laptops really quickly, that while we are discussing this, we need to think about how welcoming spaces make engagement possible. What does a welcoming space look like, and from whose perspective? I'm going to end it over here and invite Edith, if you have any other thoughts, to share as well.
Yeah, I think those are really important points. And I just want to bring in Samuel Patantes, who identifies as Afro-Latino, said that schools are primarily white middle-class spaces, and those who come from the white middle class do better in schools. And so how do we transform the school environment so that they're more responsive And do we need to really think about where we meet parents? There's some school districts that do home visits, and the home is a really important place full of knowledge and traditional important information. And how do we meet parents in a neutral place and build those partnerships instead of having parents come to school where they may feel, because of the way that we engage them, intimidated. Schools can be very intimidating for parents who speak English. If they do not speak English, it can be even more intimidating, which is another reason that we need cultural brokers, which we're going to talk about, to navigate these spaces, who can help parents with understanding how schools are organized and navigate access to supports and services, but also speak to what their children need, speak to the strengths. Because if you really think about it, oftentimes parents go into schools when there's a problem. And that's where we have to be more proactive and go meet parents where they are and build those relationships, not necessarily in the school building, but in a place that's more comfortable, convenient, and reflective of the child, because we can learn a lot from those spaces that where we visit parents. This is obvious that once a parent is partnered with a school, that child is going to do better. That's a clear data point, and just getting to that point is the biggest challenge.
Thank you, Edith. And I think this really brings up the question, how can we assess barriers that may be preventing family engagement? Feel free to, while you're discussing and just kind of thinking about this question, to drop your thoughts into the chat. But again, how can we assess these barriers that are preventing the engagement that we want and that we need? And that's really where we're going to be delving into on our next slide, if my tech will allow me to do so. There we go. Amazing. So in front of the screen, you will see the title Barriers to Newcomer Family Engagement in an orange block. Below that, you'll see 5 different bullet points on different ways of identifying barriers for newcomer family engagement. If you think of more that you don't see on the screen that you have experienced from your district or you have just thought of, feel free to put it in the chat as well. I'm going to begin with the first bullet point of having personal barriers to newcomer family engagement. And this, is a lot of, it encompasses a lot of what we said before about, both newcomer families coming in and resettling, having this lack of information, feeling like an outsider, not really knowing where to begin, especially when folks are moving out and about just around the space. It gets very jarring. So there is, that aspect of having this personal barrier of not really knowing where to begin, not really knowing what you don't know. And that is a lot of what I see with the families that I work with one-on-one as well. Not knowing that there are resources in the library that are free, not knowing that you can sign up with a library card regardless of this and that. All you need is just proof of residence. Not knowing where other multilingual communities are, especially if you're coming alone and not necessarily with a group of a community. Below that, it's a perfect segue really to, thinking about cultural barriers. And by what we mean by that is what is seen as proper or appropriate for different groups of people and cultural norms. Edith has really amazing examples that she is going to be bringing up later that really pertain to a cultural barrier, and what that means when we think about how to assess what is needed and what types of interventions might be useful for schools when we're thinking of proactive strategies. But a little bit on that too is, what types of religion are folks coming in with? So what types of, mannerisms are folks used to? How folks are engaging with teachers in their home country may be different from how they engage with teachers in this country. And making sure that, we're really coming from 2 perspectives of both knowing and making sure that we're as open and receptive as we possibly can to the idea of what is the cultural norm in our newcomer family's home country, but also making sure that we also are able to guide our newcomer families to understanding what cultural norms and standards they may meet when they are interacting just daily with folks here as well. So knowing where to begin and why some cultural norms are, shape our perspective and our interactions and communication with our families and make them the way that they are is really important and also a significant barrier to keep in mind as well. To the right of the screen, you will see 3 additional bullet points. The first one is something that we're really going to be thinking more heavily on today, regarding language accessibility, on how things and materials may or may not be translated for families that are multilingual, that are learning English for the first time, or just, have some form of English knowledge already. And I'm just so happy to hear from folks in the chat as well about all the amazing work that is being done to translate and interpret, for our families and also for our teachers on what is possible on one-on-one meetings, for different documents, for guidelines and such, for robocalls. That's just amazing to hear about. And I thank you and applaud you for that work. It's awesome to hear, genuinely. But also, thinking about language accessibility in terms of addressing it with cultural norms, and also with cultural context. What is missing from, accessible translators and interpretation? What is missing context that folks might need to know about when the information is being turned from one language to another? And how do we make sure that folks are getting this information where they can access it? And that's a really big and important part of language accessibility as well. Moving onwards to institutional barriers, we talked about this, Edith, especially about how the system is, again, not designed for folks like our newcomer families. So acknowledging that and knowing that we are in the system together, where we have to be very intentional on the types of strategies that we're utilizing, and that sometimes a lot of barriers may come to light that may really prohibit us from doing what we want to do ideally for our families. And knowing that our newcomer families face the exact same struggle is critical to just making sure that we are all on the same page. And lastly, something that we, talked about briefly but haven't necessarily directly addressed yet is this idea of impermanence for our newcomer families. That locality and access is very different for families that are resettling, than families that are, moving but are already acclimated to the States itself. And what we mean by that is, really acknowledging that a lot of us are coming from districts where families are moving in shelters within the same district, or are moving from shelters to another district. That McKinney-Vento is a difficult process for all of us to, navigate, especially when it comes to transportation. But also acknowledging that while all of this is happening, our newcomer families are also facing, and I'm speaking about this as somebody with lived experience of waiting for visas, speaking and waiting and fearing the process of what if something doesn't go through? What if I have to go back? What is going to happen to me? What is going to happen to my family? And this is, a mentally exhausting process that is a lot for anybody to take, especially for our kiddos, especially for our parents, and especially for you, as somebody that's navigating the system with us and with them. So just wanted to acknowledge all of these barriers. If you think of more, I again welcome you to put them in the chat. And I'd like to pass it over to Edith to see if you also have any additional points you'd like to bring up after we've just kind of gone through all the bullet points here.
Sure, just bringing up a specific example of a barrier.
Yes, please.
In one high school, we had a large group of Somali students who were new to the high school. And in terms of the girls, they were Muslim, and before lunch, they would wash their hands and their feet. And so this is part of their ritual. And so that led to some bullying and some teasing by other students who responded negatively to this process of the religious ritual that these girls were engaged in. And it came to our attention And that is a religious practice. And so I say that because it ended up being a situation that resulted in trauma for the students that the school had to respond to by meeting with the students who were engaged in the bullying. But it was also educational learning that the school had to do. And so the school did make some arrangements to ensure that they weren't bullied, that they were able to practice their religious ritual prior to eating. But that's an instance of if the school learned about the things that they need to be aware of proactively, that could have been avoided. So it really is, how do you assertively get to know what you don't know and ensure that there's not teasing or bullying as a result of these students on top of everything else, because the other students are engaged in this negative response. So with the cultural broker, and I know we're talking about that, it's really important because if you really think about it, it's like if we have cultural brokers, it's really having a person who's sort of like a middle person who has knowledge and information that can create opportunities for both sides, can inform from the family's perspective and have the school engage in anticipating what is needed. With the Somali girls, I will tell you that there's a university that had the same problem. What they did is they created sinks so that the sinks would accommodate the Somali students at the university. So they had sinks that were amenable to washing feet. And so that was part of a structural adjustment that they made, in addition to saying, we are addressing and integrating what needs to happen so that we are an inclusive community. But the cultural brokers, it's really thinking about what is an effective means of communication so that the school understands the population that they're serving and can respond appropriately so these students do not have a negative experience and are not traumatized in this new school environment, and they have to intervene. And so that's really where brokering are steps to really help families have a sense of agency, to understand, the rules and regulations, much of which may need to be changed, like in this case, and break down information so that it's understandable. And of course, the parents were very, very concerned with this incident, but the communication piece is the most critical piece, with the hope that we're building trust. And you cannot build a relationship that is meaningful unless there is trust. And with this situation, there was an erosion of trust because of what happened to these students, and that had to be rebuilt. And the school did work on it, but you don't want to wait until there's a critical incident or a negative experience and then try to intervene to build a meaningful relationship. And that's where being proactive is really, really helpful. A positive end is, so for a family who is from the Dominican Republic, for this a young man, he was really, really good in math, didn't speak much English, but by having a home visit, and home visits are really critical, the school was able to learn that this young man helped his family who had a food truck. He did all of the negotiations, the sales, he kept the records on what was sold. He went to the bank and helped his family with bank transactions. That's math. So how do we take that skill and how do we learn about that experience and integrate it into math? Because he has a skill that could be nurtured in school. He's very strong and understood math. So how can we create mathematical problems that represent real life experiences in that scenario? So those are just two examples of, if we speak with parents and we know what questions to ask, because sometimes it's not, we don't know the right questions to ask. And that's where someone who shares that culture can navigate what is the information that you need to know to make this experience with the students positive, and really have a conversational interaction where the family feels comfortable disclosing and sharing stories about their journeys, their experiences, their children's gifts and talents.
Yes. Thank you, Edith. I feel like those are really insightful examples to give, and I think they exemplify, different problems, not just academically, how this sort of barrier may impact a student, but also how this barrier may impact the whole classroom. Um, and that's just also critical to know about, and also to think back to that percentage that we talked about earlier with 17.6, how this number is big and meaningful, but also it impacts everybody. So hopefully folks have found insight from that. Before we move on from this slide, I'd like to read out a couple of comments that we've been getting in the chat as well about other barriers that isn't necessarily described in this. So Valeria says, no, that wasn't Valeria, that was Wayne. Wayne says transportation, and definitely that is a really big factor into a lot of barriers that folks have been saying too in our community of practice, that is being held monthly, that transportation is a huge issue, not only for McKinney-Vento students, but just for students, newcomer students and families in general. Kathleen also says transportation, but also childcare and homework help. Alexa says work opportunities. And Valeria says helping parents get to know you. Yes, thank you for those additions. I think all of this is really, critical to understanding how, having a strong relationship and fostering that relationship and trust with a family is critical, not only to family engagement, but also, the rest of the perks that come with it, such as, if kiddos go to school, there's less childcare needed because then the kiddos are at the school. If kiddos are going to school, they can bring back resources that the schools have already collected and gathered for the families. And it really is this like very intersectional idea of how do we make sure this one thing happens while keeping in mind that it impacts a lot of factors, not just culturally, but also in terms of language, institution, locality, transportation, childcare, healthcare, all of these in the ways that they impact us in our work. So thank you all for pitching in. Looking forward to more. Also see, oh wait, no, I think I already said this, work opportunities. I love it. I'm gonna move on to the next slide. See a couple of head nods, I'll do that. So this is a slide to both acknowledge that we have been hearing from folks from our community of practice for school districts on newcomer families, and also to invite people to both, say more about this in the space, or to also join us in our upcoming community practices to be a part of this community. So for folks that might not know yet, FCSN has been doing a monthly community of practice. We've started in January. We're going to be ending it in May, with the potential, if folks are really excited and want to do this more often, to continue and extend it throughout the summer as well, or to create more groups. But we're a pretty small and cozy and tight-knit community of folks that come together monthly whenever we can to discuss different topics on how school districts are doing, how we're feeling, to, kind of support each other and to figure out challenges and to just kind of idealize what could happen for us together as a group. The next one is on April 11th, which, if I'm thinking about this correctly, is next week. Yes, it is next week. I just did the math. The next one is on April 11th. We'll be talking about translators and interpreters. We're there mostly to facilitate this conversation, but this space is for you to, think and address things as a community anonymously if you want to, off the record if you want to, but just for you, it's existing for you as support. And what we have over here on the slide is some topics from the discussion results and takeaways from the last community of practice on parent voices and cultural gaps. It was a really amazing conversation. I think I see a couple of folks in here that were in the conversation. So if I say something that pertains to you, or if it was something that you share, feel free to just go like, hey, I did that. That'd be awesome. But in terms of the description for the slide, at the very center, you'll see a block that says parents' voices. Around that are little boxes that have 5 different categories for general takeaways that we've received from our discussion on parent voices and cultural gaps. This is representative and reflective not of all of our school districts, but a lot of school districts that have joined us include Needham, Chelsea, Everett, and such. So if you identify with these, please feel free to let us know. If you don't, and if you think there's something missing, we would love to see that as well. And we'd also love it if you want to say something and put down your district in the chat as well, so we know who is saying what and what ideas are coming from what districts. But I'm going to go through this pretty briefly for folks. But in terms of like going from the left and in a counterclockwise motion, we've heard from folks, and this is a lot of things that folks wanted to do and are already doing. We heard from folks that we really want to create opportunities for parent participation. And a couple of ways that folks have been doing that are firstly which is awesome. And I think this is a really great opportunity to just kind of celebrate the work that everyone is doing already. But to offer survival English classes and use them to empower families to engage in decision making. And I think that's a really powerful concept. I know a lot of folks out here are already doing this work, and I applaud you for it. This is amazing. A lot of other folks have talked also about collaborating with parent leadership institutes and providing multilingual information as much as they can, and making sure that there is, like a middleman essentially that goes between the schools and between the families. And really, that is the essence of cultural brokering. So I love that as well. Going again counterclockwise down to proactive strategies, a lot of our conversations have been really addressing the shift in mindset that we are all facing from thinking of this as a short-term, sort of solution thing where we can just stick a band-aid on something, to how to create this as a proactive strategy that really emphasizes and elevates the the existing work that has already been done to create a system that works for us. And a couple of things that folks have been saying is to conduct parent focus groups, or just to talk to folks one-on-one to gather feedback on what folks need, what is missing from the conversation. Some folks have also mentioned that they do use data that they collect for reflection and planning for both families and districts. So making sure that the data they collect from the one-on-ones or the little focus groups of families is being distributed both ways. But also to really think about what a sustainable model looks like with input from both families and community partners that offer basic need resources. The one in the middle says empowering parents to advocate. And what that means is to, again, in survival English classes and in handouts and multilingual,
That's why I have this
parents understand how to advocate for the children's educational needs, and to also consider cultural norms and values when we are working with newcomer families. And that is a lot of what Edith has, talked about in her examples prior to this
Yeah, I
slide.
think someone needs to mute.
Hold on. In my back.
Someone needs to mute.
I'm
Melissa,
not sure who it is.
she could mute. I'm not sure she's aware that she's not muted. Okay,
Oh.
good.
Okay,
We're good.
awesome. We're good. Thank you. Okay, moving again, rerouting my brain, rerouting again back to moving to counterclockwise again to the right side of the screen. In terms of support systems for parent leadership, folks have mentioned that a really great, strategy that people want to focus on and learn more about is to provide resources and support for parent leadership, such as contact with PACs or CPACs or LPACs. And we'll be talking about this a lot more in our May webinars as well. There's one on May 5th, May 2nd, not 5th, and there's also another one on May 16th on fostering relationships and partnering with PACs on how to welcome newcomer families, if folks are interested in that. And lastly, on the very top, addressing disparities and biases. And what we mean by that is to figure out together what types of implementations of different strategies and initiatives that can narrow the achievement gap between our kiddos that are already in the system and the kiddos that are coming just right in. I know that was a lot of information to just kind of dump on you, but hopefully this kind of brings some insight to some conversations that are already happening, not within just particular districts, but together with all districts. And hopefully this gives folks a clearer idea of what other people are doing, and to just kind of think and reflect on some new ideas or some old ones that are happening as well. So, Edith, if there's anything you'd like to add on, I'm going to pause a little bit for you before I move on to the next slide.
Sure. I'm really excited to get to the framework guiding principles, and this is where we're going to turn this over to you for your review and conversations. I know that you got it, and you already have the framework, and I hope you had an opportunity to look at it. This is where we're really emphasizing the cultural brokering and the process that can be successful, particularly when there's an understanding of both cultures, so that that person represents not only the culture and also the language. And this person who's doing the culturing brokering can really help with not only building connections and communication by helping schools provide culturally responsive practices in ways that support and assist families navigating school structures, including programming, services, and agencies, but also the cultural brokering can help to build that parent and family self-advocacy so they can access family serving programs. That's really, really important. And that cultural broker can be either an interpreter, can be a religious leader, can be an advocate, family member, or even a school staff. So this is where we'd like you to take an opportunity, and we're going to put you in breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. I'm just checking the time. Actually, maybe we can narrow that down to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, just to kind of have a conversation amongst yourselves, and we're going to ask you to look at just one principle and think about the work that you're already doing in schools, that schools are already doing, districts are already doing, and what other things can be done to implement this particular principle in your school. What does that work look like? So this is where we're going to turn it over to you, because we are a collaborative community and we all learn together to really think about what is the next step in ensuring that we're advancing this work, because I know a lot of you are already doing this work and you're doing a great job with it. And how do we really advance this work so that we're incorporating all of these principles?
Yes. And just to make sure that folks are clear about the prompt, we would love to have somebody assigned for the group, a note taker. There's about 4 to 5 participants per room. I'll be behind in the main room to ensure that if there's any tech difficulties, folks can come to me and I'll reassign you. Once you go into your breakout rooms, you will find that the groups are numbered, and we are doing that so that each number relates to one guiding principle. So you will find in your emails from this morning the PDF version of this if you would like to just have it on you and read it a bit more clearly. But the goal of this 10-minute exercise is to make sure that we're looking at these guiding principles and finding out ways in which family engagement can be directly tied to cultural brokering, and how this generally isn't really a new concept at all. It's things that we've been doing, but putting a label to it is critical to understanding how to make it flourish. So I'm going to create the rooms right now. You should be able to go in automatically, and to please let me know or come back into the main room if you have any questions. And we're looking forward to hearing from you in 10 minutes.
And
Does
please
that
make
sound
sure
good,
you
Edith?
have someone to share out so that we can hear your wonderful thoughts and what you're already doing. So that would be awesome.
Okay, we'll see you in 10.
10 minutes.
Hi, Anne. This is Heidi.
It'd be nice to hear one or two. It'd be nice to hear one or two big ideas that you came away with, what school districts are doing or could do. And Principal 1, does the group that addressed Principal 1 want to start?
I'm not sure what group I'm in, but I would love to express my idea.
Sure.
All right, so my name is Melissa Fonseca. I'm the Portuguese liaison working at the Madeline English in Everett. One of the things that I really feel that would help out parents, I would like to see if we could have an informative meeting where parents know what we expect from them, what we expect from the students, as well as what they should expect from us. Because I feel like some of these parents, like they're scared to speak up because they think, what if this affects my immigration status? Or what if, it's going to cause an issue futuristically? And also about the attendance policy, whereas we have a lot of students that have bad attendance. And the reason for that, I feel, is not that the parents are trying to do that purposely. It's that they're working really, really well. A lot of my parents are telling me they're going to work at 5 a.m., so they can't get their kid to school right when they're supposed to. But if we elaborated on what our laws are, our regulation, whereas a lot of parents have told me, I didn't know that it was an obligation they have to be in school. And it is. So if we could, I don't know, I don't know if we could collectively have a meeting, not to make the parents feel any, shame or anything of the sort, but more so to give them guidelines of what they can expect from us and what we expect from them.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Ann.
Give me a second while I do the tech stuff. Okay. Thank you, Melissa, for sharing. And that was very insightful. I think really what you're saying, if I'm hearing correctly, is making sure that there's a space to communicate, and making sure that the communication is twofold. So thank you for speaking up about that, and I'm really appreciating that idea. Edith, if there's anything you want to add on before we perhaps move on to somebody else?
That's where the cultural brokers can use strategies to really share with parents what the expectations are, what was not working. And there's a approach of at the kitchen table, of going to the home and in a space where parents live to get the information directly from them, and having interpreters, not who are, it's really important that the parents are centered, and asking the kind of questions like, how does the experience here differ from your home country? How does your child get to school? What are some of the barriers? And really building that trust with parents in a space where, yes, some parents are going to really worry about their immigration status, and that's important for them to know that we're not sharing any information. Schools do not share information, and assuring parents that they can speak in building trust. And that's where the cultural brokers are really important, because you want to have people who share the cultural experience, but also the language, and can help navigate those kinds of spaces and ameliorate those fears, misunderstandings, mistrust, or concerns that parents have. So, Melissa, you're spot on about some of the things that we need to do in terms of helping parents to navigate these spaces, and doing it in a way that builds a trust and makes parents feel safe. And that might not be in a school environment. It might be like, what is convenient? You work all night and you need to sleep during the day. How can we best connect with you? Is it during the evening? Is it on the weekends? Is it in your home? Like, do we, who can we meet with to build trust that you are being centered and your concerns are being addressed?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Edith.
I also
In the
want to
last
add
couple of
something.
minutes. Oh yes, please,
Yes.
please go ahead.
Ivana from Andover. I think that we also have to do a better job here, at least I can say here in Andover, is how important it is for parents to show up to the LPAC meetings. That is just, I feel like we need to do a better job at communicating and letting everybody know about these meetings and how important it is, just because, we have different families from different countries, and they're new here in the town. They don't know, what I mean? Like, just to give them more information and get to know, what their kids are going to be doing in school, how they're doing and all that. So just kind of like emphasizing, like, how important it is to attend these meetings. I don't think parents take this meeting as serious as they should. So it's something that we have to work on here in Andover.
I know parent to parent, there are some, in one particular district, there are affinity groups. So parents do meet in a space, in a community space, not at the school, that they feel comfortable and connected to at a time that's convenient for them. But what you raise, Ivana, also calls for the need to have parent-to-parent, one-to-one interactions with someone who is a cultural broker and who can explain to parents or share the information that they need in order for them to convey that information. Sometimes parents are not able to go to meetings, and how can you still get that information? And so what I found is when you have all the parents who come from the same countries, speak the same language, and share the culture together in the same meeting, sitting at a table together, that kind of builds confidence that I'm going to see someone that I can connect to. And so there's a lot of ways that districts can change their practice, because a lot of times, we might not know what to create, but the cultural broker who, like I said, shares the culture and the language and comes from the same country, most ideally, if they are a parent as well, can help the schools to transform what our expectations are, so parents feel more comfortable. And maybe we're shifting our practice too, because it's not just listening to the parent, but it's saying, gee, we're doing this all wrong. Let's do it a different way. And what does that structure look like that's going to be amenable to parents feeling comfortable engaging in this space?
Yes. Thank you all that have shared so far. After this session is over, I will be sending out both a survey to just kind of reflect on how folks have felt about the session, how, folks find information helpful, if there's anything else that they would like to add that they weren't able to share during the session because we are running out of time. And also just generally some information, especially the slide deck from today, as well as the YouTube video that we're going to be uploading shortly. So thank you all. We wish there was more time, but unfortunately we are at 4 p.m. So we're going to end here today. I'm going to stop the recording and just do like a brief thank you for everybody. And Edith, if there's anything else you'd like to add while people are just kind of wrapping up and leaving as well.
Yeah, I wish we had more time, more examples, because it is about not just making connections, but it's about networking, mediating, proactive problem solving, and negotiating. And that means us changing as educators those spaces that we create that we may think are welcoming, but we're not getting the response, so that they're not actually welcoming. So there's a lot of work here.
It's a lot of work.
A lot of work. But thank you all so much. I'm sorry we don't have more time, because there's so much more to discuss.
Yes, but thank you all again. I will stop the recording.